Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to today's learning lessons, Expectations for Forests and the Land Sector at COP21, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Emmeline, and I am the Communications Associate with the FCP program. Our presenters today are from our team. It's our team lead, Peter Graham, our policy director, Josefina Branya Varela, and another policy staff member, Hermina Clayman. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It is important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, this sometimes happens if you have too many browser windows or programs open, so feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue. Or you're also always welcome to join us by phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send Jenny Guzman a message in the chat window if possible, and we'll try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions using the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with Forest and Climate additional resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll get started. So Peter, why don't you take us ahead?
Thank you, Emmeline, and hello everyone. Thank you for your interest, and I hope this will be an informative session, and I really look forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A section afterwards. So my name is Peter Graham, first of all. I lead the WWF's Forest and Climate Program. So we are 10 days before the opening of COP21 in Paris. We have 194 parties plus the European Union represented, as well as hundreds of accredited observer organizations representing civil society, indigenous peoples, business, research, and faith communities. And why are we all planning to show up there? Well, of course, the aim of the UN summit in Paris is to seal a universal international agreement on avoiding dangerous climate change, one that has legal force. Personally, I am optimistic, not because the negotiations are necessarily moving more smoothly than ever before, but because, for example, 140 countries have already submitted their intended nationally determined contributions and are already implementing actions that indicate that we are already shifting to a low-carbon future. Now, in terms of the negotiations, we have been here before in Kyoto and in Copenhagen, but this latest effort was launched in Durban in 2011, where the outcomes included a decision by the parties to adopt a universal legal agreement on climate change as soon as possible and no later than 2015. Now, WWF expects the world's governments, next slide, Emily. WWF expects the world's governments to reach a strong, fair, and universally binding agreement at COP21 in Paris that ensures the world has a fighting chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. As we all know, the main cause of global warming is the burning of fossil fuels. However, we have a particular interest in forests and the land sector as well. We know from IPCC reports and others that we cannot achieve the goal of limiting global temperature increase to either 1.5 or 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels this century without reducing the current high rate of emissions from the forest and land sector. We feel that an agreement that ignores a sector that contributes, next slide please, Emma, an agreement that ignores a sector that does contribute a quarter of global emissions is not an efficient solution to climate change and would effectively exclude some countries from meaningful participation in the new climate regime, i.e. those whose land sectors represent a very large percentage of their national annual greenhouse gas emissions. We must strengthen support for and not lose the most promising development in global forest conservation, the incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, also known as Webplus. Also, we cannot forget that forests are key to both mitigation and adaptation. And with that brief and higher level introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Josefina Brana Varela and Hermine Klemen to get into the nuts and bolts of the texts, where we've come in the last year, and what we look forward to seeing coming out of Paris. So over to you, Josefina. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the road from Paris to Lima, and I think just as a refresher, when we left Lima a year ago, countries started to get down into the text of what could be the climate agreement and how we would start envisioning the first draft of the text that we hopefully are going to see being approved in Paris. So this year was all about having insertions in the text. The first exercise that parties went over was in Geneva back in February. And this was an exercise of being inclusive and introducing all parties' concerns. That was a good exercise to build trust, but took us to 82 or 83 page long text. That was important in terms of, again, building trust, but again, it kind of set the agenda for the whole year in terms of working hard to try to reduce the text and narrow down the options. It was a text with a lot of brackets, with many options, and with many insertions around the land sector, the principles that need to be approved or included in the new climate regime to make sure that the land sector is included, and also many, many other mentions on Webplus scattered over the whole text. We had 3 intersessionals this year. After Geneva, we had the Bonn session in June, and then again, parties managed to come forward with some decisions pertaining to Webplus that we are going to talk in a little bit. But what is important to highlight, I think, is that the text has been changing over the year and has been expanding and getting more shorter and getting expanded again. What we saw in the last intersessional in Bonn a couple, almost a month ago, was that parties entered the discussions with a very, very short text that the co-chairs put forward, which was very sector neutral. There was almost no reference to any sector. And parties entered the negotiations with that very, very short text under 20 pages. And coming out of the last intersessional, what we saw is countries again making all sorts of insertions, including bringing back the references to the land sector and to RED. And there was a lot of insertions on Webplus in the mitigation section. There was a lot of insertions on the land sector in different sections of the text, and we are going to right now talk about these sections. So can we go to the next one, please? Okay. So as Peter was explaining to you, we are coming into Paris with still high hopes that we are going to be able to work out a new text that would be constituting the climate agreement, and that would be approved. For us in WWF, and for this topic in particular, for us, we are looking at in 2 different dimensions. One is the land sector and how this should be included in the new climate agreement. And that means that we are talking right now about the post-2020 action, because the climate agreement will be only getting into force after 2020. So for the land sector, as you can see in the very long text that parties will have to deal with entering into Paris negotiations, we had a lot of scattered direct or implicit mentions on the land sector, in particular related to the characteristics of the land sector in the sections of the preamble, which are very general references, but are important and are still there. In the mitigation section, recognizing or trying to explicitly mention the role that the land sector plays, and in the transparency section, because it's needed to have clear accounting rules for the land sector and how these emissions are going to be accounted for both in developed and developing countries. So there was many mentions scattered in the text, and we know that probably these many references are not going to remain in the text, given that parties will have to go over the very expansive text to try to compress it and to come into an agreement. So WWF is asking parties to keep their references at least to the principles that must frame climate action in the land sector in the text in order to increase transparency and completeness of the new climate regime. We understand that the agreement needs to be short and needs to be powerful and direct. So we also understand that there should be additional COP decisions that are not going to be part of the agreement, but that are going to be decisions adopted by all parties that create a process to develop a set of our framework towards a comprehensive rules and guidance in the land sector accounting, meaning that right now we have rules for Webplus, we have rules for LULUCF, and we still have the CDM guidance. So all these three set of different guidance modalities are applicable for the land sector. So how we can move towards a more comprehensive accounting system for the land sector. And I think this is definitely not going to be resolved in Paris, but we would like to see at least a decision that starts setting that process on for the next year. Let's just remember that the land sector is both a source and a sink of emissions, and therefore the transparency discussions and the transparency references are key to avoid weak ambition in other key sectors. These discussions are not new. They have been around since the Kyoto Protocol discussions, as countries can use the land sector to offset emissions from other sectors. There must be rules and clarity on how ambition cannot be weak or lower in, for example, in phasing out fossil fuels. So that for us is key, and that's why the transparency section of the agreement is important in these references. I guess we can go to the next slide. And with this, I'm going to ask my colleague, Hermine Kleiman, if she can walk us through the references in the new climate agreement.
Okay, thank you, Josefina, and welcome everyone. As you might know, the text which we went into the last bond session did not include any reference to REDD or the land sector. And now in the current version of the agreement text, there are several references to REDD+ in the preamble as well as in the mitigation section. Although these references have been strongly advocated and supported by a group of tropical countries, the language remains in brackets, meaning it does not enjoy the support by all parties and will therefore be further negotiated in Paris. WWF would like to see a strong signal in the current text about the important role that REDD+ can play in realizing the mitigation opportunities in developing countries' forests. We would therefore like to see at a minimum for the finance section of the agreement to guarantee financial support for REDD+ beyond 2020 by emphasizing and recognizing all the progress made to date under the UNFCCC, including the Warsaw Framework for REDD+. For many developing countries, and the Climate Action Network has had a lot of conversations, especially with the African countries, it is essential to refer to REDD+ in the agreement in order to send the right political messages so that current and future government leaders in REDD countries are being kept reminded that REDD+ remains a priority for national action in developing countries and equally a priority for donor finance. Next slide, please. So, while the current language for potential decisions to be adopted in Paris is still under negotiation, Substaff 42 in June agreed on a set of decisions related to REDD+ that have been forwarded for adoption by the COP. One of them, it's three. It's three in total, and one of the three is safeguards. And to give you a very brief history and context, the SBSTA decision on safeguards complements especially previous decisions by COP16, which is the safeguards annex, as well as the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, COP19, which provides the roadmap for results-based finance, amongst others. So in order for REDD country to receive results-based payments, it should have all elements of REDD+ Phase 2 in place, which, amongst others, requires a safeguards information system for providing information on how safeguards are being addressed and respected. These informations need to be provided in a manner that ensures transparency, consistency, effectiveness, and comprehensiveness. So the REDD countries are to share the latest summary of information, which needs to be periodically updated through countries' national communications and voluntarily on the UNFCCC Information Hub. So this has already been decided. Now, the SBSTA decision in Bonn therefore further concretized the type of information countries should provide in their summaries. So SBSTA again reiterates that information should ensure transparency, consistency, comprehensiveness, and effectiveness. SBSTA asks countries to provide information regarding which REDD activity they carry out in the light of the safeguards. And REDD countries are further encouraged to provide information on how they interpret their safeguards in the national context, including categories of type of information. Next one, please. So the second decision SBSTA made in Bonn was on non-carbon benefits. So in 2013, SBSTA had invited parties and observers to submit their views on the need for further guidance on non-carbon benefits, as well as on non-market-based approaches, to be submitted by March 2014. This issue had finally been taken up by SBSTA session in Bonn only in 2015, this year, with the conclusion that eventually no further guidance on non-carbon benefits was needed, but SBSTA recognized the importance of non-carbon benefits for long-term sustainability of REDD, emphasized that non-carbon benefits are unique to national circumstances, that countries are invited to share information on nature, scale, and importance of non-carbon benefits, and again it reiterated that methodological issues do not constitute a requirement for development for countries seeking support for REDD+ or results-based payments. Next one, please. So the third and last decision SBSTA made in Bonn was on non-market-based approaches. And as mentioned above, views on non-market-based approaches had been submitted in March 2014 alongside the non-carbon benefits. The concrete mandate for SBSTA then was to the consideration of the development of methodological guidance on non-market-based approaches, such as joint mitigation and adaptation approaches for the integral and sustainable management of forests, which is the Bolivian proposal, in fact. So the summary of the SBSTA outcome was that countries who wish to do so can use the alternative approach towards achieving emissions reductions from REDD+ through the JMA. Doing this, the country would need to come up with a national strategy or action plan in order to support the integral and sustainable management of forests. Countries doing so can identify their needs for support and develop proposals. And the decision further encourages financing entities to continue to provide support for this alternative approach. And there's actually already room under the GCF, and as well as an explicit link to REDD safeguards, meaning that all REDD safeguards also are applicable to the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism at the same time. With that, I hand over back to Josefina, I guess. Thank you.
So can we go to the next slide? Thank you, Hermine. Okay, so we have been talking about the new climate agreement, and that corresponds to the post-2020 action. But action can happen and must happen now, and that's what we have been knowing as the action agenda now. I guess before going to explain a little bit of the Lima Paris Action Agenda, I just want to make a quick reference to how the negotiations under the UNFCCC are structured at the moment, and that has been the workstream one, pretty much related to the new climate agreement and to have this text ready for negotiation into Paris, and then the workstream two of the platform, the Durban platform, which is related to pre-2020 action. In the past, parties have been discussing on how to increase ambition and how to accelerate action in this ADP workstream. However, the discussions around this workstream have been focusing on technical expert meetings, and we, as you may remember, we had a technical expert meeting under the UNFCCC last year, and to try to discuss how climate action in the sector can contribute to close the gigaton gap. So that has been, let's say, kind of like the inside track of the UNFCCC, but there's also lots of things happening in the outside world in parallel with the UNFCCC climate discussions. So we all know, and I think more and more people are realizing that we need to help countries to reach a peak of their emissions before 2020 if we want to limit our temperature increase to a 2 degrees world before it becomes very dangerous for humans and for nature. So these activities in 2020, since they have been limited to technical discussions, there is the need to expand this action to the real world and to really know how we can propose incentives and clear scale-up action to contribute to close the gigaton gap. The forest sector has this potential to contribute substantially. In all these discussions in Lima, the government of Peru, the government of France, the UNFCCC Secretariat, and the United Nations General Secretary Office launched this initiative called the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And this Lima Paris Action Agenda has the main objective to catalyze action at scale from non-state actors and to showcase that climate action is happening, can happen, and is already happening, and we need to scale this up. So the main focus of the LPAA is try to catalyze these ambitions before 2020, but of course we live in a continuum, and these discussions between, or the differentiation between pre-2020 and post-2020 are useful for having a discussion, but in real life we are talking about a continuum moment in time. So whatever starts happening now, and if we are able to increase ambition now, indirectly we are helping for countries to have more ambitious plans after 2020. So that is the intention of the LPAA, and this platform for action that includes not only governments but also non-state actors includes several topics. They have some actions in cities, transport, renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. And one of these pillars of the LPAA is the forest pillar. So the idea of the forest pillar is to promote this idea of collaborative partnerships in which state and non-state actors or developed and developing countries can come together, commit to reduce their emissions from deforestation and forest degradation through these mechanisms of call and response, in which developing countries are willing to commit and be more ambitious through their INDCs, and donor countries and other non-state actors can stand ready to support this ambition and creating a virtuous cycle in which we help to increase ambition before 2020. So we, as WWF, support this narrative of the forest pillar, and we see this not only as an initiative that will be concluding in Paris, but actually we see this as a potential prototype for climate action in the future, understanding and recognizing that government action is key, is crucial, and is important, and we do want to have their ambition reflected in the new climate regime, but also recognizing that other actors are key and important to peak these emissions before 2020. So we also are asking parties to increase these collaborative efforts to scale up ambitious actions and to support the forest sector pre-2020 and beyond. We know that the rules for REDD have been approved in Warsaw in 2013. We have a framework that is ready for action. So we are just hoping that now we can move from talk to implementation, and that REDD is a good vehicle to start climate ambition now. Okay, I think we can go to the next one. So I just wanted to show you this infographic that we in WWF have developed to explain why forests are key to a successful Paris Agreement. You can download this from our website, and I think in general summarizes the discussions we've been having in the webinar today, and it's a good help in our advocacy work, and if you're interested, you can just download it and use it to support your work as well. I guess for us it's important to recognize that we are coming into a key moment for the climate discussions at the end of this year, and in a few days in Paris, the world will come together, as Peter was saying in the beginning, and for us it's key that while we recognize that the climate agreement and the new climate regime cannot be 100-page long text, hopefully it won't be like that, it will be very powerful, succinct, and clear. We do think that a climate regime that does not recognize the land sector and forest in particular, it's not going to be an effective climate agreement. Although we recognize that we cannot have specific mentions and insertions, exhaustive mentions of this sector, we do believe that it's key for the agreement to send the right signals to politicians that we must have an explicit recognition of the role the land sector plays. And in particular, I think we need to recognize the need to have an explicit reference of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in the finance section, and to guarantee that the finance will be there to support these efforts post-2020, but also to help increase the support and the visibility of the forest sector in the political agendas, in particular in developing countries. So with that, I think I'm going to finish, and I'm going to give back the floor to Emmeline, and we'll open for questions.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really thorough and very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions from you from our listeners and participants. The first question that I'm going to put to all the panelists broadly, and I'll let you decide who wants to answer it, is what happens if the land sector is not included in the Paris Agreement? Josefina, I think you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. If Peter doesn't want to take it, I guess it's related to what he was explaining in the introduction. If we realize and acknowledge that the land sector is the second emitter, and that it contributes 1/4 of global emissions, I think we are not going to have an effective climate regime if it's not included. At the same time, there's many developing countries which have a profile of emissions that is heavily skewed towards the land sector. So the land sector is the main source of emissions in many tropical countries. If we don't recognize the land sector in the agreement, then we limit the options of mitigation for these countries. So we need to promote this flexibility and recognize the importance and the possibility to be more ambitious. If we limit this and we don't provide the right signals or the right incentives, many countries will be very limited in the possibilities to mitigate and to have climate action in sense of in terms of the forest. But also, as probably we didn't go in depth, forests are key not only for mitigation but also for adaptation. So that is also a particularity of the sector that has to be recognized. But for climate change, is key to recognize that forests would be helping the solution from both sides, mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you, Josefina. Peter, I don't know if you want to follow up on that, but just for our participants to know, if you do have questions, there is a question screen in the GoToWebinar interface, so you can submit your questions to our presenters. Peter, did you want to follow up?
Well, thank you, Emily. And no, that Josefina provided a comprehensive answer, so I will just leave it there.
Okay, the next question we have is from Anuja, and they're asking if the agreement mentions agricultural and forest waste, and if it addresses the issue of lack of data. So I think if Josefina wants to take this one.
Yes, thanks, Anuja, for the question. I think there's the discussion certainly have addressed the issue of agriculture. And this has been a very, very contentious issue over the years, and in particular in the last 3 years, there has been an attempt to try these discussions under the UNFCCC, and parties haven't been able to agree on what angle to take on the discussions. There's a big group of countries, in particular developing countries, that would not want to talk about agriculture and mitigation, but that are very open to talk about agriculture and adaptation. A big group of developed countries would like to talk about both mitigation and adaptation when it comes to agriculture. So these very polarized differences haven't allowed parties to come forward with text around these issues. And about the forest waste, not really, in particular, not specific in the agreement, because if you see the text is really, really general and high level, and it does not go into the technical details. So there are COP decisions that have been adopted in the past that will be kind of like supportive of the climate agreement, but the climate agreement itself won't have these technicalities. There have been some discussions in the past in the framework of the land use change and forestry discussions that try to tackle these technical issues, talking about harvested wood products and about natural disturbances and these questions related to the forest sector, but we won't see them in Paris.
And perhaps, Josefina, if I may add 2 points. The first, just to elaborate on why there is resistance to referencing agriculture and mitigation together, and this is really around the interpretation that there's the risk of limiting food production, particularly for developing countries, by creating an incentive for mitigation. So there's an assumption that mitigation equals less food production, and that is obviously a key fear of many countries. On the waste, just as Josefina said, if countries are following and IPCC guidelines for reporting on their national greenhouse gas inventory, there are established methodologies and procedures for reporting on emissions resulting from harvesting and the forest waste, as you've called it. So that will be a level of detail that we don't expect to see in this final text, although you have seen in countries' INDCs that how they plan to account for harvested wood products. That's somewhat related to that question.
Thank you, Peter and Josefina. Our next question comes from Kelsey. She writes, it was mentioned that not all parties support the reintroduction of red references in the preamble and mitigation sections. Could you give examples of parties that don't support it?
Probably there are parties that are not against red, but they are advocating against explicit references in these sections, just because once you enter red, then there would be other attempts to insert, for example, language about loss and damage, or language about I don't know, it becomes a laundry list. So I think we should make that differentiation, that not necessarily because they don't want red included, it's because they're against red or not. So I know that there's been an attempt from, for example, from developed countries to have a more broad climate agreement, more general agreement. In particular, obviously, the U.S. government is talking about something very, very sector neutral that can be short and that can be easier for them to work out through their system. But there are many other countries in particular, and also developing countries that are supporting RED, but would not think that is a useful exercise to have explicit mentions just because it opens a laundry list. I don't know if, Hermina, you have an example of a country in particular, but I think in general sense, it's a group of tropical countries led by the Coalition of Rainforest Nations that have inserted these references to RED in the preamble, and that have actually proposed some alternative language in the mitigation section of the agreement. So these countries are proactively supporting these reinsertions, while the rest of the countries are more cautious about explicit references, just not to overcomplicate the discussions. But I don't know, Hermina, if you want to complement this.
No, that's basically the background thinking of it. So when I was in Bonn, we have talked, like with the Climate Action Network, we have talked to a lot of both developed and developing countries, and it was mostly the developed countries or the further advanced countries in RED arguing that they wouldn't need a reference to RED Plus in the agreement for the reasons Josefina just mentioned earlier. But also they would also argue that the agreement text as it is, they expect it to be rather short and sector neutral, and that RED from a purely legal perspective would remain, even though it was not going to be mentioned in the agreement text. But then we have had very intensive discussions and conversations, especially with the African countries, and as they have not been that much advanced as, for instance, Brazil or Mexico, they were arguing that they really need to have the reference in order to advance further on RED, and especially for new incoming governmental leaders, that they can actually refer to something which had been actually agreed by 196 countries, including donor countries, and they also say that they need to have this in order to secure donor support beyond 2020. I stop here.
Perhaps I'll just add, this highlights the challenge for the negotiators and others who are advising and pressuring them, that there is really only the first week of the Paris 2 weeks that is going to be, that the purpose will be to narrow down that text to a minimum number of pages required for ministers to finalize consensus, to reach consensus on some of the outstanding critical issues. And as Hermina referred to, this need for balance, where some things like, for example, RED may seem to be too minor relative to the broader issues of differentiation, finance, and overall mitigation. And there is a real risk that is lost. But there's also a need for appreciation of how different parties value that text. And as Hermina pointed out, there are some countries that really use international agreements as a stronger influence to domestic action than perhaps other countries. So it will be a challenge in the first week to strike that balance, but also meet the needs of particular countries to be able to encourage them to move forward.
Great, thank you all. Our next question comes from Richard, who writes, carbon sequestration in agriculture has been a contentious issue. Is there any indication of whether this might be in the agreement or not? I guess this might be too technical. So I think, if Josefina, you want to start us off?
Yeah, as mentioned in a previous question, this has been a very contentious issue, and mainly because of this issue of what is the scope of the discussion under the UNFCCC. Do we want to talk about mitigation or adaptation or both at the same time? And this has been pretty much the bottleneck on the discussions. Pretty much some developing countries would not like to see limitations in terms of food security. So agriculture is very, very linked, obviously, to insecurity, and there's this uncertainty about what these discussions are going to be about. And until there's not a scale of finance that helps countries to shift towards low carbon developments, this discussion has been really not been welcome in terms of mitigation in particular. There would be some technical expert meetings. I think actually this year probably one of them happened, and there would be more technical discussions. But in the agreement, we won't see any particular references to agriculture. So I think that's why a reference to the land sector is key, because the land sector is not only forest, but it also will include agriculture. Although we don't have the specific rules and modalities to talk about agriculture under the convention, this will keep the door open for future work in this. And for us in WWF, it's key to reiterate that food security is a priority, especially for developing countries and for least development countries in particular. So these discussions have to be taken from a perspective of equity and fairness, and there has to be a clear scope on how these discussions can be moved forward in the following year. But in the climate agreement, we won't see this discussion.
Thank you, Josefina. Okay, the next question comes from Mercedes, and she asks, regarding carbon accounting, will the agreement include any language indicating how emission reductions will be accounted for? Hermina, do you want to start us off, and then Josefina can add on?
That's a very good question. Obviously, I'm not an expert on carbon accounting. So, I mean, from our perspective, especially with regard to the land sector, it's really crucial that we will develop something up to 2020 that will provide a more comprehensive framework for accounting from all emissions, including both developed and developing countries. This is of particular importance for the land sector accounting, since it is a mixture between natural disturbances as well as anthropogenic interferences, but also because it's both a sink and a source. But that also applies, of course, for any other accounting which has currently been going on under the Kyoto Protocol or in any other mechanisms such as the CDM or Webplus. And it's really important that from a carbon accounting perspective, all emissions are actually accounted for what the atmosphere also sees. But with that, I would like to hand over to either Josefina and Peter.
Sure. Thank you, Hermina. I'll just add to that. So in the mitigation section of the current draft text, you will see some language relating to accounting in general. Obviously, it is key to the monitoring and success of the agreement and making sure that we know how close we are to achieving our goal over time. So with regard to accounting and forest and land sector, there's language in there that looks to establish broad principles for accounting. As you know, through this process of more bottom-up, flexible approaches to the INDC development, that there are some ranges of accounting approaches that are being used by countries. Following IPCC good practice guidance and inventory guidelines, but that from our perspective, there is a need for some oversight and some review in more detail of the accounting approaches that are currently proposed to be used by countries, or are being used. And so we look to a post-Paris process. Hopefully within the Paris Agreement we get as close as possible to a clear set of accounting principles and clear recognition of the valid international guidelines and approaches that have been recognized to date, but also after Paris to establish a process through which we can dig into those approaches a little bit more, that the parties have a chance to provide further information, demonstrate how their methodologies for accounting are consistent with international norms, and ensure that there's no, say, loopholes would be the classic term that we've seen in the past. So, Josefina, if you want to add anything more about those different work programs, perhaps that would be appropriate, but otherwise, that's all from me.
Thanks, Peter. No, I think we still need to see what the decisions in Paris are going to be, not pertaining to the text of the climate agreement, but what the decisions parties will adopt as part of or support to the climate agreement. So one of the things that we are looking at in our advocacy work is to create the right links and hooks to the land sector, so further work can be developed further in the next year. One thing that we have discussed with many parties and we have had good reception or receptivity about is the principles for the land sector. And these principles for land sector accounting, and this has to do with making reference to the IPCC guidelines, and also to the principles of the convention. So, for example, the principle of once in, always in is key, meaning that once a country start reporting about land sector or one of the activities, you always will be reporting in the subsequent years. So it's not that you pick and choose this year what you want to report, and then the next year you report about other things. We have to be consistent, and we have to create a system that is transparent and complete. So this set of principles we have proposed and we put in the table. Many parties were very supportive about it. We realized at some point that some of the principles we were kind of like delineating or highlighting for the land sector will also be relevant for other sectors. So that will give us more chances for such a language to be in the agreement. So this is pretty much what we, it's not an easy task because the agreement is going to be very general, but this issue of accounting is key for the land sector, and certainly we would like to see some hooks in the transparency section of the agreement that will allow us to develop further work in the years to come.
Great, thank you, Josefina. I just want to remind participants that we do have time for one or two more questions. So if you have a question that you're burning to ask, please feel free to ask that through the questions window in your GoToWebinar screen. I'm going to pivot to a different kind of accounting in this next question and ask, where do you expect most of the REDD+ money will come from up to 2020 and then after 2020? Josefina, let's ask you.
Sure, I can start, and Peter and Hermina can complement. Part of what we are seeing in this narrative of the Lima Paris Action Agenda is that the current levels of finance that are out there are not enough to promote this scale-up action. So we are seeing other non-state actors coming forward. For example, last year in the Climate Summit in New York in September, there was this New York Declaration on Forests that was endorsed by many countries, but also a lot of private sector companies. And these private sector companies are now coming forward with deforestation-free commitments. And we, as WWF, are trying to work with some companies to help them understand what are the implications or what does it mean to become deforestation free, and trying to help these companies to restructure the way they buy their inputs, and that they source only from sustainable sources. So I think it's obvious that public finance is key, and it cannot be substituted, and we need to push for scaling up public finance. But it's also evident that we need to engage other actors that have not been traditionally part of the climate efforts, and that has to do with the private sector. So big companies are already taking some steps in that direction. We need to bring others to commit and to start acting as soon as possible. And also there's some discussions that had started a few years ago about how the financial sector can be engaged. So I think from here to 2020 and beyond 2020, public finance is key, but we are going to see more and more engagement of private sector, and this is going to be key to be able to scale up climate action to the level we need in order to peak emissions before 2020. I don't know if Peter or Hermine had any other comment.
Thanks, Josefina. I'll just add one aspect. I'm really encouraged by the developments over the last few years in the recognition by the private sector, especially companies, in their role in both in achieving climate change goals, but also in reducing deforestation and the drivers of deforestation. So there are two aspects of private sector engagement. Some of it is in the actions, so the commitments to source foods and other commodities, natural resource commodities, in a manner that does not increase or lead to contribute to deforestation or forest degradation. And so that may not involve a over-the-counter financial flow, but is a change in practice that has economic consequences to the companies. The other aspect is influencing private sector investment. There are movements that are out there to ensure that large institutional investments also have conditions that say what you're investing in should not contribute to deforestation or forest degradation. And also we're looking at innovative, probably further innovations in financing tools, green bonds, and others that can support green economic developments on the terms of the countries in which investments are made. So I'll just wanted to add those few points, but that's it for me.
This is Hermine. Maybe two more points on that is when we talk about the channels that will channel public finance, I guess what will become more important or will become important up to 2020 and beyond is the role of the Green Climate Fund for channeling public finance, as well as, I guess, to a smaller part, or maybe at least private finance. But we can also expect that the forest carbon partnership facilities, multilateral finance will continue beyond 2020, as well as the finance coming from the FIP for the Forest Investment Program. But I hope, and I'm convinced, and I expect to see also some further pledges coming from more bilateral space from donors, such as maybe Norway, Germany, and the UK. They have already come up with the joint declaration of intent last year in Lima, where they have not mentioned any numbers to their intent. So we hope to see a little bit more meat on the bone when we go to Paris. So there will still be quite a wide variety of public finance channels continuing beyond and beyond 2020. I stop here.
Thank you both. And I think we have time for just one more question. So I'll put it to you. What do you expect the Paris Agreement or decisions to say about the role of carbon markets? And I'm going to put that one to Peter first.
Thanks, Imogen. Well, haven't been tracking the markets dialogue as closely as some others, but in general, it's not clear exactly at this point how that's going to turn out. Personally, I'd expect it to be fairly high level. and hopefully, from our perspective, certainly, that some key conditions be recognized on the use of carbon markets, and double counting, or no double counting, obviously, would be a key condition that we would be looking to see in there. I don't expect to see any additional language that links carbon markets to forests of the land sector, for example. There is already previous decisions from Warsaw that provide some guidance to that respect, but I very quickly don't at this point see where any detailed decision will come out of Paris on the role, of how carbon markets will work under the new agreement. That I expect would be it establish a work program that would elaborate that over the next 5 years. Perhaps Josefina or Hermine, if you have anything to add from.
Yes, Peter, the only thing I would add is that the discussions of the new market mechanism under the convention have been very, very slow, and very little clarity has been achieved. And this new market mechanism under the convention would be providing the general framework for all sectors, or I think at least that would be the idea. So given the lack of clarity and the uncertainty on these discussions, as Peter mentioned, for RED at least, there's a wide range of opportunities and options on how countries want to move forward with the national efforts, and that has to do with multiple sources of finance that are recognized in the text of the decisions related to Webplus, and make explicit reference to a wide variety of sources: public, private, market, non-market. So as it stands today for forests, I think it's up to the country, to the RED country, on how to structure their national strategies and action plans, and what kind of pathways they want to follow. But formal market for carbon is still under discussion. So the voluntary market is there. There's some piloting mechanisms, for example, the carbon fund that is starting to pilot these payments for results in the context of RED programs. And there's some capital from private investment there trying to test how this would work in the future. But so far, the new market mechanism discussions are still not being resolved under the convention.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think we're just at about our time. So I want to thank all of our participants. Again, remember, we have additional resources for you if you're interested in following up with what some of the topics that we've covered here today. We'll also be sending you a follow-up email with some additional resources, as well as the link to the YouTube channel where you can watch this webinar again if you'd like to. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. And
Hi,
please
thank you.
Keep in touch.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.